Over the past month or so, we've covered mass protest movements and the way those stories have been reported from Hong Kong to Baghdad to Beirut. This week, we're looking at Chile and the largest demonstrations there since the end of the Pinochet dictatorship almost 30 years ago. The unrest was set off by a price hike on public transport, but the larger contextual issues include rising inequality plus an unrepresentative political class, news outlets included. Chile has the most concentrated media ownership in Latin America. There's a lot of resentment on the streets, directed at TV channels. Accusations of too much airtime on looting, not enough on either violations by the security forces or the underlying issues behind the civil unrest. The historical backdrop is central to this story. There's a deep, lingering resentment of the news media, which goes back to the Pinochet era. Chileans remember that the Fourth Estate failed them utterly back then, and they're saying that journalists still aren't listening to them today. Our starting point this week is the capital, Santiago.
There's a perception that journalists are not telling the truth. Disconnected to vested interests. Mostly private interests. Most of the protests were shot by drones from really high in the air because they would have problems with the camera in the street. The vans would be vandalized.
On one hand, you have this massive protest, and they all wanted something better for the country. On the other hand, you have this terrible story of violence. Lootings, burning buses, burning cars, total destruction, chaos. And the army on the streets in a state of emergency. And that, of course, reminds everyone from what happened in Chile in the 70s and 80s, the dictatorship. Everybody knows how it started, and nobody knows for sure how will it end.
What began as a spontaneous protest over the rising cost of a subway ticket in Santiago has morphed into a national movement that wants to talk about a much bigger issue: inequality in Chile. Starting in the mid-1970s, the country went down the neoliberal path, embarking on a privatization binge the money markets approved of. But it left citizens having to shell out for a range of privatized services: education, healthcare, pensions, which many Chileans say do not deliver enough. The richest 1% holds more than a quarter of the country's wealth. They are well positioned to affect, if not control, the news narrative. Nowhere in Latin America is media ownership as concentrated as it is in Chile, which partly explains why the conflicts on the streets are not limited to protesters taking on security forces. Those protesters are also targeting journalists.
Television channels and mainstream radio have not carried balanced coverage and haven't reported the ill feeling on the streets. What TV channels have done is to remain on the side of the ruling class, opinion makers, and experts. But what is the underlying issue? It's that the neoliberal, neo-capitalist model is at the expense of social rights. Rights that were stolen during the dictatorship and which remained hijacked as neoliberalism was deepened by our democratic governments.
What has happened here is enormous protests fueled by social outrage, and the media has felt bewildered. They don't know how to manage the situation. This is a movement that doesn't have leaders controlling the masses, so who represents them? Who can journalists dialogue with? How can TV manage, process, and present this social movement?
We have to remember that almost the entire media in Chile belongs to private corporations. That kind of power is present in the way they control the media. So even when a journalist is trying to show or depict a kind of image of the mobilization, ultimately what people perceive is that these vested interests are manufacturing the kind of news and the kind of portray of any type of mobilization.
A recurring grievance of protesters is the Chilean media's emphasis on conflict at the expense of context. They accuse privately owned channels such as Megavisión and Channel 13 of feasting on images of looting and violence, while starving audiences of analysis of the underlying causes of the unrest. The agendas at play are not merely ideological. They are commercial too, the ratings chase. And TVN, the national broadcaster, is no different. Like other state-owned institutions in Chile, it has had a neoliberal makeover. TVN is reliant on ad revenues in a way public broadcasters in other countries are not, leading to coverage that leans towards the sensational.
The first days when you were seeing or watching the news, I remember very clearly the screen divided in two. This was TVN probably. On one side of the screen you had a fire in the street. And this went on for hours, this fire on the screen. The most important thing visually was this fire. And what does it mean, fire, in a context like this? It means riots, it means danger.
The form of media that dominates Chile's streets is social. It's where protesters organize, get their news, and share stories of news coverage that fall short. And it isn't just domestic news outlets and reporters feeling the heat. Foreign journalists are too.
Announced a hike in the metro fare.
Al Jazeera's correspondent, Teresa Bo, was targeted after this live hit. Stuck at the fringes of a protest for technical reasons, she had demonstrators going after her, not for anything she said, but because of what her camera was showing.
Que una productora le dice a estos hueones que salten. Que mierda la mentira, hueón.
The anti-Bo social media campaign was aggressive, complete with death threats. She left the country after being assaulted on the street.
You can see in Facebook and Twitter and Instagram all these hashtags like don't trust journalists, basically. Don't trust the elite, turn off the TV, apaga la tele, or turn off this particular station. There is this anger. People in the streets say, oh, you know, you're not covering this, you're not covering that. But you cannot expect a TV station, a traditional news outlet, to behave as a social media, showing everything at the same moment, in the same way. So it's very challenging. And there is a lack of trust in elites, and the media belongs to the elite.
Looming over the media story in Chile is some dark history. The Pinochet dictatorship, which lasted from 1973 until 1990. And the country's oldest, best-selling newspaper, El Mercurio, has more to answer for than most. In the early 70s, the paper was bankrolled by the CIA, paid millions of dollars to produce stories to destabilize the democratically elected government of leftist President Salvador Allende. It then went on to cover up brutal human rights violations committed by the Pinochet regime, which killed thousands of Chileans. Many of the demonstrators have long memories, and it's no wonder that the paper's offices in the coastal city of Valparaiso were broken into and set alight.
Que siempre se le está pidiendo a los medios.
The media are always being asked about their support for the 1973 coup. And El Mercurio is being asked when they will do their mea culpa. They haven't done it till now, and they are not going to do it. So we need to know, what perspective does this right-wing media outlet have on reality? Is it trying to maintain the economic model? Is it trying to protect its business interests? Is it trying to retain its privilege and hegemony within the media system?
We have come from a dictatorship where the military had an important role. This is a memory, a painful memory. The attack against El Mercurio is symbolic. It is a very important newspaper in Chile associated with a right-wing movement that was in line with Pinochet. You cannot talk about Chile without knowing what El Mercurio has said.
Days into the demonstrations, President Sebastián Piñera declared a state of emergency while surrounded by men in uniform. It was a sharp visual reminder, as though Chileans needed one, of the past. Later, appearing before the live cameras, Piñera added a declaration of war against the demonstrators, one in which journalists are more than just collateral damage. The Media Watch NGO Reporters Without Borders says media workers have been arbitrarily and violently arrested, targeted with tear gas, and shot at with rubber bullets and live ammunition. But unlike 1973, this time everybody has a phone, a camera, and a chance to tell the story.
So you have tons of footage of people reporting in the streets, shooting what's happening.
Basic.
And you have to put this in a large context. It's the one of 1973 and the coup d'etat. If we, in 7 days, we have this tons of footage showing atrocities committed by the police officers and soldiers, can you imagine the level of violence committed at that time